Proto-Alexandrian manuscripts, aren't they?
As I put on the screen, sir, what I meant by that was P75 is not the direct ancestor.
No, but they're
of
still
B.
in the same line of. They're so much in the same line of tradition that they're cousins virtually, aren't they?
Okay, I'm attempting to answer, but you're just arguing with my answer.
But you're not seriously going to contend that P75 and B are not in the same line of tradition, are you?
I obviously defined the term line there as direct lineal genealogical ancestor, which I did in my opening statement as well. What I'm saying is, while they're both clearly Proto-Alexandrian manuscripts, they are in the same stream. They represent two different lines within that stream because Vaticanus contains readings that are older than P75.
Okay, let me ask this. How many genealogical lineal manuscripts do we have related to one another?
I don't even understand the question.
Well, you just said that they're not in a lineal genealogical line with each other. In other words, one is not a copy of another.
Exactly. P75.
How many copies of other manuscripts do we actually have?
All I said, sir, is that P75 is not what was copied to make Vaticanus. I don't have any other way of expressing the statement that there was one.
Question. I'm asking how many copies of manuscripts do we have? In other words, where we have the original and the copy.
You mean where we absolutely know which one was copied from which?
You're saying B is not a copy of P75
because it contains different, more ancient readings. Yes.
Yes, I got that. So, but I'm wondering if that's usual or unusual. Do we have copies of manuscripts in the tradition?
We don't have, the only thing I can think of you're asking is something like 1739 where we know something about the nature and the origination of what it is a copy of, or even Bézé or something like that. But very rarely do we know the exact lineal parent of any manuscript in the first 1,000 years.
Exactly. I mean, so the fact that one isn't the copy of the other is in fact completely normal, right? Because we don't have copies.
Yes, sir.
But they are so closely related that they're in the same line of tradition. Yes?
Of course. Yes, sir.
Okay, good. What then does the fact that B is close to P75 but not a copy of P75, B copied in the year 350, say, what does that tell us about copying practices in the year 70?
I said what it does is demonstrate that the onus is upon the skeptic to assert that there is corruption in the primitive period, because since we have multiple lines coming out of the early period, and yet it's the same New Testament, that if there was some kind of primitive corruption, you would have multiple corrupted lines coming out that vary massively from one another, and that is not the case.
Excellent. Oh, that's not the case.
No.
So you said in seminary you did some collations of early manuscripts. Tell me, how do the early manuscripts stack up against each other in comparison with the later manuscripts?
Well, as I've said in my published works, the vast majority of meaningful and viable variants take place within the first 250, 300 years of the transmission history of the New Testament. That's a given.
Yeah, let me reword it. If you compare two Byzantine late manuscripts to one another,
of course,
will they agree a lot or not very often?
Well, of course. So the variations between a 14th century Byzantine minuscules are almost totally based upon scribes falling asleep or slapping a bug while they're writing.
What about the early manuscripts?
The early manuscripts, because, as I said in my opening presentation, they're being done in a very different period of time where very rarely did Christians have access to scriptoriums or things like that because of persecution taking place, the destruction of text and things like that. There is a much wider variation between them.
So the earlier the manuscript, the more differences there are between them.
As P72 demonstrates, these men were not, by and large, well, P75 is different, but P72, P66, these were not professional scribes.
1 minute.
I'm sorry?
Okay, so let me just say something. The point is that the earlier you go, the more different they are. So you just extrapolate that the earliest were probably the most different. Let me ask about P72, where you resonate with this particular text, you said, that has 2 Peter and Jude in it. What other documents are found in P72?
There are some non-canonical documents in P72. My recollection was that 1st, 2nd Peter, and Jude were the only canonical documents in it.
Right. So I'm just wondering about your resonating with this document. I mean, do you think the scribe thought that what he was copying was Scripture?
Well, I don't think that you can simply jump to the conclusion that because scribes included books in a single codex, that meant that they believed that everything in that codex was necessarily Scripture. There are all sorts of works that were considered to be very beneficial for the reading of people that were included in codices that were not necessarily canonical.
Yeah, I just thought that it was odd that that particular manuscript is one that you resonate with because it's the earliest attestation we have of the Protevangelium Jacobi.
Time?
Okay, good. Thank you.
Dr. Ehrman, you said in your rebuttal that P52 contains a major, I believe it was, you can correct me please if I was wrong, major textual variant that changes the meaning of the text. Do you have access to a textual variant there that is not listed in the Nestle-Aland text?
It's the restoration in the lacuna, as Metzger points out in his manuscripts of the New Testament, of the absence of the words eis tuta before eleluta. And there are a couple of other variants. I mean, there's a full discussion of it in Metzger's book on the manuscripts of the New Testament.
And you would consider this to completely change the meaning of the text?
No.
Okay, all right.
It changes the meaning of the text.
Okay.
I think anybody who thinks that the words of the New Testament are inspired has to think that the words matter. And so if the words change, that matters.
All right, Dr. Ehrman, since you disagree with, evidently, Kurt Aland on the issue of tenacity, could you list for us some variations in the New Testament where you are willing to assert that none of the extant readings in the manuscript tradition could possibly be the original?
No, I think there's always a possibility. It's not a question of possibility, it's a question of probability. Of course, anything could possibly have been original. The original author might have written nonsense. And why not? It's possible. And later scribes might have corrected that nonsense. So one has to weigh probability. It's interesting that Westcott and Hort, the two giants in this field in the 19th century, were quite insistent that most of the text of the New Testament was preserved in a codex like Codex Vaticanus, and yet they resorted to conjectural emendation on a large number of occasions. If you want an example, if you want just one example, I mean, I don't know how much sense it'll make in English, but one common one that my teacher, Bruce Metzger, used to talk about as being possibly a strong case for emendation is 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19, which follows a creedal statement about Christ. The Greek text